Praise be Jesus and Mary. Amen. We've been offering a series of reflections on a holy and healthy spirituality. Our last few reflections have dealt with the topic of fear. Today we're going to speak about rules. The word rule comes from the Latin word regula, which means a straight stick or a bar or a rule. It's related to the verb regere, which means to rule, straighten, or guide. So good rules help straighten out our life. They're like an invisible guide that helps us to walk in the right direction, in the right path. A life without rules is a life without direction and a life without purpose. And good rules are not arbitrary. They're actually expressions of right relationship. For example, Jesus says in John 14:15, "If you love me, you will keep my commandments," i.e. you will follow my rules for living. 1 John 5:3 adds, "This is the love of God, that we keep his commandments, and his commandments are not burdensome." His rules are not a burden, they're actually a blessing. So rules for life are important. And actually, in every sector, in every corner of life, there are rules. Whether you're at home or at the gym or at work or in school or in church or on the road or at the golf course, every place has its rules. Following the rules brings with it a reward. Breaking them leads to a repercussion. For example, if you drive well, drive soberly, obey the traffic laws, you can keep driving. That's the reward. If not, your license will get taken away from you. That's the repercussion. So reward, repercussion. Even families need rules or they can't function properly. In the spiritual life, in the family of God, there are godly rules which lead to freedom. For example, the 10 Commandments and the moral requirements tied to them, which are all geared towards right relationships. There are also the precepts of the church, canon law, which is the laws that govern the church. There are personal rules of life. There are also practices embraced by religious orders for penitential purposes or for a certain uniformity of life. So there are godly rules which foster a sense of responsibility, respect, and humble service towards others. The wider problem nowadays, probably perennially, the wider problem is that people don't want to follow God's rules and godly rules, especially in regards to living morally. In a literal sense, many people are unruly or undisciplined. They are not disciples of Christ. So many people in our culture are oblivious to basic moral precepts because they've grown up in faithless families, or there are others who have that spiritual illness known as religious indifference, don't really care. Still, there are others who simply actively suppress and fight against moral and spiritual do's and don'ts. In dealing with people, it can be helpful to understand why they act or live in a relatively lawless spiritual way. Are they rebellious or undisciplined in life because they don't feel loved or sense of significance? They don't have a sense of security. Is this their way of trying to get their needs met or crying out for attention? Or maybe is there some other reason? But whatever the underlying subjective motive is, it doesn't change the objective fact that many people live apart from God's rules, apart from his law. Now, among those who take their faith seriously, there can also be excessive rules or legalistic spirit. To be fair, many people or groups in this camp often start out wanting to do well, wanting to do what's right. But they aren't able to see that rigid rules tend to foster pride, a false sense of security, and spiritual bondage. In these church or religious circles, more rules equals more holiness. And this echoes a religious approach very much akin to what we see in the Gospels with the scribes and the Pharisees. More of a popular or literary embodiment of the spirit of legalism can be seen in Victor Hugo's work, Les Miserables, with Inspector Javert. I don't know if you've ever seen that or read that book, The Police Inspector, Inspector Javert. He's very rigid. He's a ruthless upholder of the law. Charles Laughton played him in a 1935 film. It's the only movie version I've actually seen of it. Certainly not someone you want to have on your case. Inspector Javert, no mercy, all law. St. Paul says in Romans 5:20, where sin abounds, grace abounds all the more. Those in the spiritual rigorist camp focus on the first premise, and they conclude, well, sin abounds, therefore we need more rules to curb it. The grace abounds all the more part of that verse is often ignored. Excessive rules or legalism tends to shrink the heart and foster a performance-based spirituality. Again, it fosters a false sense of security, i.e., I'm good because I follow the rules. Legalism can be a substitute or a stand-in for the virtue of prudence. I need rules because I'm not good at making prudential judgments. Excessive rules and a legalistic spirit often contrast with the virtues of charity and mercy because the focus is on rule following and not on Christ-likeness. Rigid rule following focuses on what's wrong and it looks for mistakes rather than focusing on and encouraging the good. It's rooted more in fear than in trust. Rigidity and legalism doesn't give the Holy Spirit room to breathe because it just puts him in a very small box. And it tends to foster or breed in authoritarian circles. And in the end, it creates a very self-focused spirituality. I actually think that excessive rigidity was the reality in a good number of religious orders prior to Vatican II. And so with the Council, the pendulum just swings to the left, loose side of things, right? So you go from righty-tighty to lefty-loosey. Probably heard of that before. Too much rigidity, too many rules, then you swing to no habits, to labyrinths, to New Age, to embracing the spirit of the world. The pendulum just swings the other way. Regarding rules in the spiritual life, in essentials there should be unity. In non-essentials, liberty, so freedom. In all things, there should be charity. In more rigorous circles, it's more like in all things, conformity. Conformity for them is often synonymous with charity, but it's actually not true. It's not really charity. It's more like a cookie-cutter spirituality. Everyone has to look and think and dress and talk and be exactly alike. That's excessive. The balance is somewhere in the middle between being too lax and too rigid, because the culture is too lax in general with morals, with dress, with speech, with entertainment, with religion, with approach to life. The temptation is to go too far in the opposite direction, to try to balance out the scales, right? It's an understanding, reaction, response, but it's not necessarily the best one. I think that in part, the draw of the Latin Mass with the number of people, I think that's it. I think it's because it's so radically different from the spirit of the culture. Don't have any problem with the Latin Mass per se, but unfortunately the Latin Mass environment brings with it its own culture. Culture that tends to foster a number of unhealthy spirituality traits that we've been discussing in this series, and among them is a fixation on rule following. It can get to the point even where in these circles you sense that your every word or action or decision or outfit is being uncharitably and suspiciously scrutinized. It's a spiritual climate that can very much kill the Spirit of God. So we need to be careful that rules don't become rigidity. And for those of us who have been or are in those church circles that tend towards rigidity, we need to remember that rule following doesn't make us holy. Charity and God's grace are what make us holy. Even godly rules are geared to help facilitate right living and good relationships and holiness, but in themselves they are not holiness. Charity is grace, and charity is holiness. The odd thing, though, is that a rules-focused spirituality, it's actually a lot easier to follow than a grace-based or charity-based spirituality. It's actually easier because charity's messy and not easy, and it's more of a daily crash course. Rules are neat, clean, simple, easy. Say the black, do the red. Pretty easy. Charity's more like black and blue and Lord help me, Lord help me. This is just ridiculous. But goodness and holiness are more virtues of the mind and of the heart. And so just because I'm an excellent rule follower doesn't mean that I'm automatically spiritually on the right track. We always have to be careful about judging by externals. St. Teresa's definition of holiness is always good to bear in mind. She says, holiness does not consist in this or that practice. It consists in a disposition of the heart, which makes us humble and little in God's arms, conscious of our weakness and confident, even daringly confident, in the goodness of our Father. So as we embrace and follow godly rules, we need to let God mold and shape our hearts to become more like His heart. Let's ask Our Lady for the grace to be able to give God the freedom to do that in our life. Praise be Jesus and Mary, now and forever.